Something in the soil at a Bronze Age mound on the northeast edge of the Dead Sea does not make sense. In a destruction layer dating to roughly 1650 BC, excavators found what you would expect from a city that burned: ash, collapsed walls, charred timber. They also found things that standard Bronze Age archaeology does not easily explain. Pottery that had partially melted and resolidified. Sections of mudbrick wall exposed to temperatures so extreme they had vitrified, turned glassy. Grain stores apparently flash carbonized in an instant, rather than consumed by a fire that spread and built. And beneath all of it, a city of substantial size that was simply never rebuilt. Abandoned for what the evidence suggests was several centuries. What ended it, and whether it connects to the event described in one of the most famous passages in the book of Genesis, has become one of the most actively contested questions in biblical archaeology today. For 2,000 years, people have been searching for Sodom and Gomorrah. Recent excavations have given that search somewhere specific to look. What the evidence actually means is a different question entirely. This is Bible Stories Unearthed, where we retell the narratives of Scripture alongside the history, archaeology, and ancient world that give them their full weight. Today, the cities of the plain, the long search for Sodom and Gomorrah, and what excavations at a site in the Jordan Valley are revealing about one of the Bible's most dramatic moments of destruction. The Jordan Valley in the Middle Bronze Age, roughly 2000 to 1550 BC, looked nothing like the landscape most modern visitors encounter. Fed by the Jordan River and enriched by centuries of alluvial deposit, the valley floor was fertile, densely farmed, and well settled. Egyptian and Mesopotamian records from this era describe Canaan's cities as prosperous nodes along trade routes connecting the great powers of the ancient Near East. The Bible describes this valley with a specific Hebrew word, the kikar. It means roughly a disc or circle, a reference to the flat, rounded floor of the Jordan Valley as it spreads out above the Dead Sea. Genesis 13 records Abraham and his nephew Lot standing on high ground near Bethel, surveying the land they must divide between their households. Lot looks toward the kikar and sees something that stops him. It is, in the text's own words, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, well watered everywhere. He chooses it. In this period, Canaan operated as a mosaic of independent city-states, heavily fortified, connected by trade, and periodically caught up in the conflicts of larger powers. The cities of the plain that Genesis describes were 5 settlements within this world: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admu, Zeboim, and Zoar. They appear briefly in the life of Lot, who settles among them, and they reappear in one of the most vivid and terrible scenes of divine judgment in all of Scripture. For thousands of years, people have been trying to find them. By the time Genesis 18 opens, Lot has been living in Sodom for some time, drawn there, as the earlier records show, by the extraordinary fertility of the plain. He has prospered. By the events of Genesis 19, he is sitting at the city gate, which in the culture of the ancient Near East was not simply waiting. It marked a man of civic standing, someone involved in the life of the community. Abraham, meanwhile, is at the Oaks of Mamre in the heat of the day. 3 visitors arrive without announcement. What begins as an act of desert hospitality, water, rest, food, shade, becomes something else entirely before the visitors depart. Abraham learns that God intends to go down to Sodom and Gomorrah to investigate. The outcry against them, the text says, is very great. Their sin is grievous. What follows is one of the Bible's most remarkable passages. Abraham does not simply accept what he has been told. He steps forward and begins to negotiate, gently, persistently, with a careful precision that gives the scene a texture unlike almost anything else in Genesis. If there are 50 righteous people inside the city, will you spare it? Yes. What about 45? Yes. 40? Yes. 30? Yes. 20? Yes. 10? Yes. Abraham stops at 10. There are not 10. The two angels, departing from Abraham, arrive at the gate of Sodom as evening falls, and Lot recognizes immediately that the strangers need protection. He insists they come to his house rather than sleep in the open square. In the ancient world, hospitality to travelers was not optional courtesy. It was a sacred obligation, a binding social contract that defined the moral fabric of a community. What happens at Lot's door that night has generated centuries of theological reflection and scholarly debate. The men of the city surround the house and demand he hand over his guests. The angels strike the crowd with blindness. Then they tell Lot the thing he cannot fully believe. Gather your family. Take everyone you trust. We are about to destroy this place. The outcry against it has reached the Lord, and he has sent us to destroy it. Lot goes to warn his sons-in-law. They think he is joking. At dawn, the angels are almost physically moving him, pulling Lot and his wife and 2 daughters through the city gates. They are told to run. They are told not to look back. Lot asks for one concession, a small nearby town called Zoar. Can they shelter there instead of fleeing to the hills? The request is granted. Then Genesis delivers its account of the destruction in a single compressed paragraph that has echoed across 3,000 years. The Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. He overthrew those cities and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. Lot's wife looked back. She became a pillar of salt. Abraham rises the next morning, goes to the place where he had stood before God, and looks down toward the plain. The smoke of the land, the text says, went up like the smoke of a furnace. The Bible records total, unrepeatable destruction. Not just fire. The land itself, the geography of the plain, is described as fundamentally altered. The lush Kikar that Lot had chosen because it looked like Eden disappears entirely from the biblical narrative after this point. It is never described as fertile again. For most of the past 2,000 years, attempts to locate these cities fixed on the southern end of the Dead Sea, a shallow, salt-encrusted region where Bronze Age sites like Bab ed-Dra and Numaira had been identified. Some scholars propose these as candidates for the cities of the plain. The sites showed Bronze Age occupation and destruction layers, but their primary occupation dated predominantly to the early Bronze Age, centuries earlier than most proposed patriarchal chronologies, and no identification was ever resolved. In 2005, a team led by American archaeologist Stephen Collins began excavating a site on the northeast side of the Dead Sea in the southern Jordan Valley. The site is called Tal el-Hammam. The excavation team argued that the site's location, in the Kikar, northeast of the Dead Sea, visible from the hills near Hebron, fit the biblical geography of Sodom more closely than the traditional southern candidates. The specific claim that Tal el-Hammam is Sodom has not been accepted by mainstream archaeology and remains a contested minority position. Collins's institutional affiliation has drawn scrutiny, and the chronological alignment between the site's destruction date and the patriarchal period is disputed. But the physical evidence his team uncovered generated a paper that attracted much wider attention. Tal el-Hammam was a substantial, heavily fortified settlement, a major regional center at its Bronze Age peak, with massive walls and occupation layers running continuously across centuries. And then, in a single destruction stratum dating to around 1650 BC, everything stopped. The layer is unlike anything else at the site. Pottery shows evidence of exposure to temperatures far beyond anything a standard building fire could produce. Some pieces appear to have partially melted and resolidified. Mudbrick walls show vitrification. Human remains in the layer show signs of extreme thermal stress. In 2021, a study published in the peer-reviewed journal Scientific Reports analyzed this destruction layer in significant detail. The research team, which included specialists in impact science, geochemistry, and Near Eastern archaeology, proposed that the evidence was consistent with a cosmic airburst event, a bolide or comet fragment exploding in the atmosphere above the city. They drew comparisons to the 1908 Tunguska event in Siberia. The evidence they cited included shocked minerals, a layer of melt glass, microscopic spherules of melted iron and silica, and grain samples that appeared to have been flash carbonized rather than consumed by a fire that spread gradually. After this destruction event, Tal el-Hammam was not rebuilt. The site was abandoned for what the evidence suggests was several centuries. The 2021 Scientific Reports paper attracted substantial critical attention, and the weight of that response has been skeptical. Impact scientists, Syro-Palestinian archaeologists, and geochemists raised serious methodological objections. Several of the proposed cosmic impact signatures, critics argued, have credible alternative explanations. Shocked minerals and high-temperature indicators can result from intense conflagration events without requiring an atmospheric explosion. Questions were raised about spatial extent. A blast capable of generating the temperatures the paper described would, the critics argued, have left detectable signatures across a far wider area of the Jordan Valley than the published data documents. The paper's approach and conclusions have not achieved acceptance in mainstream impact science or Near Eastern archaeology, and the hypothesis continues to face significant skepticism in those fields. The identification of Tal el-Hammam as Sodom has fared similarly in mainstream scholarship. The site's location, the dating, and the excavation's explicit biblical framing have all drawn criticism. The approximately 1650 BC destruction date creates tensions with multiple proposed chronologies for the patriarchal period that have not been resolved. And identifying this specific site as Sodom, rather than one of the other named cities of the plain, or an entirely unrelated Bronze Age settlement, remains a minority scholarly position rather than an emerging consensus. What is not in dispute is that Tal el-Hammam experienced a sudden and violent end. The destruction evidence is real, the abandonment is real, the scale of the settlement is real. What caused it, and whether the biblical account preserves any connection to events in this valley, remains an open question that the evidence as it currently stands does not resolve in either direction. For most of recorded history, Sodom and Gomorrah existed in two completely separate worlds. In one, the story was divine judgment, literal, theological, complete. In the other, it was ancient legend, a moral narrative dressed in the language of a real landscape. What has emerged from the Jordan Valley does not settle that divide. What it has introduced is something neither camp quite anticipated: the possibility that the writers of Genesis were not inventing catastrophe from nothing, but drawing on inherited memory, the multi-generational echo of something that actually happened in this valley. Something violent and sudden and total enough that the account of it never fully dissolved into ordinary history. The melted pottery and vitrified brick do not prove the theology. They were never going to. What they do is lay real, physical soil beneath a story that has shaped human civilization for 3,000 years, and leave the question of what happened in that valley exactly where the evidence leaves it: open. Thank you for being here. This story has been told. Subscribe and return to Bible Stories Unearthed. The book is open. Let's unearth more.